It was the first day of October, and the cool autumn breeze danced through the streets, scattering crisp leaves of red, orange, and yellow in its wake. The air smelled of damp earth and distant wood smoke, the perfect scent to mark the beginning of my favorite season. Fall had always held a special place in my heart. There was something comforting about the transition between summer's lingering warmth and winter's looming cold. This fall was even more exciting than usual because it was the first one my girlfriend, Emily, and I would spend together in our new home. We had moved to a small, sleepy town about a month ago. It was the kind of place you'd read about in those cozy mystery novels. Quaint houses with white picket fences, towering oak trees lining the streets, and a forest that stretched on for miles behind the town. Emily and I had fallen in love with it immediately. I wanted to surprise her when she got home from work. I had the entire day off, so I thought it would be fun to decorate the house with autumn-themed decorations. Pumpkins, garlands of orange and brown leaves, maybe even some early Halloween touches. Emily adored Halloween, and I knew she'd be thrilled to come home to a fully decorated house. After grabbing my keys, I drove to a few local stores in town, Marshall's, Home Goods, and a local craft shop that was known for its seasonal decor. I found some great pieces, but something was still missing. I wanted something unique, something vintage that would really stand out. That's when I remembered Facebook Marketplace. I had used the app a few times in the past to find some bargains, but this time, I was searching for something special. I typed in vintage fall decorations, and after scrolling through endless posts of wreaths and plastic pumpkins, I stumbled across a peculiar listing. The photo showed an old wooden trunk, weathered and worn from years of use. The listing title was simple: Antique Fall and Halloween Decorations, $25. The description wasn't much more detailed: selling an old trunk filled with vintage fall and Halloween decorations. All must go. Cash only. Something about the picture and the description piqued my interest. The trunk looked like it had history, like it had been passed down through generations. Maybe it was the rustic charm of the trunk, or maybe it was just the idea of finding something truly unique, but I clicked on the profile to learn more. The seller's name was Thomas, and his profile picture was an eerie photograph of a house in the middle of a dense forest, half covered in fog. His profile didn't give much information, just a few vague posts and pictures of random items for sale, including some old furniture and rusty tools. There were no comments, no likes, no signs of any social interaction. Despite the strangeness of the profile, I decided to message him. I asked if the trunk was still available and if I could come pick it up today. The response came almost instantly. Yes, it's still available. You can come by after 8 p.m. The address is at the edge of the forest, off Route 17. I'll leave the light on. Something about the message made me pause. The time was odd. Who arranged for a pickup so late at night? And the mention of the forest at the edge of town felt unsettling. Still, the trunk intrigued me, and I rationalized that it was probably just an older man who wasn't used to modern technology or social norms. I shared my plan with Emily when she called during her lunch break. She immediately voiced her concerns. That sounds kind of creepy, Noah. Are you sure it's safe? The forest out there is huge, and we don't really know the area that well yet. Don't worry, I assured her. I'll be careful. I'm bringing Jason with me, just in case. Jason was one of my closest friends, a guy who was always down for adventure, even if it seemed a little weird. He had moved to the town with his family a year before Emily and I did, so he was familiar with the area. Emily reluctantly agreed, but she still seemed uneasy. Just be careful. Call me if anything feels off. Promise, I said, giving her my usual smile. But deep down, a small part of me shared her unease. That evening, I picked up Jason, and we headed out toward the edge of town. The drive took longer than I expected. The further we went, the fewer streetlights there were, until eventually, the only light came from the full moon hanging low in the sky. The road turned to gravel, and we could barely make out the faded signs for Route 17. Trees loomed on either side, their branches casting long, twisted shadows across the road. "This is starting to feel like the beginning of a horror movie," Jason joked, but his voice carried an edge of nervousness. I laughed, trying to lighten the mood. "Come on, it's probably just some old guy trying to get rid of his stuff. We'll be in and out, no big deal." After what felt like an eternity, we saw a dim porch light flickering in the distance. The house was small, almost hidden behind the towering trees, its dark, slanted roof barely visible against the sky. A rickety fence surrounded the property, and the gate hung crookedly on its hinges. We parked the car at the end of the driveway, gravel crunching under the tires. The house looked even more dilapidated up close. The porch steps were cracked, and the windows were covered in a thin layer of dust and grime. But there, sitting on the porch, was the trunk from the picture. "Guess this is the place?" I muttered, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. Jason shot me a skeptical look. "Are you sure about this, man? This place looks like it hasn't seen a human being in decades." "Let's just grab the trunk and go," I said, walking toward the porch. "We'll be out of here in 5 minutes." As we approached the porch, the front door creaked open slowly. I froze, half expecting someone to step out and greet us, but no one did. Instead, a low, raspy voice called from inside the house. "It's open. Come in." Jason and I exchanged uneasy glances. I wanted to leave. Every part of me screamed to get back in the car and drive away, but curiosity had a firm grip on me. I hesitated for a moment longer before stepping through the door. The house was dark, lit only by a single flickering lamp in the corner. The smell of damp wood and something faintly rotten hung in the air. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a few cautious steps forward. From the shadows, a figure emerged. A tall, thin man with pale skin and hollow eyes. His clothes were tattered, as if they hadn't been changed in years, and his voice was as dry and cracked as old parchment. "You came for the trunk," he said, more of a statement than a question. His gaze flicked between Jason and me, as though measuring us. Yeah," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "You said it was for sale?" The man nodded slowly. "It's been in my family for generations, but it's time for it to go. Everything must go." I glanced over at Jason, who was standing rigidly by the door. "Right? So we'll take the trunk and... Do you know the history of this house?" The man interrupted, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Do you know what happened here?" I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. "No, should we?" He smiled, a cold, unsettling smile that sent a shiver down my spine. "Some things are better left forgotten." Without another word, he gestured toward the trunk and stepped back into the shadows. The atmosphere in the room felt suffocating, as though the air itself had turned heavy with the weight of something unspoken. I grabbed Jason's arm, signaling that it was time to leave. He didn't argue. Together, we lifted the trunk. It was surprisingly light, and carried it back to the car. As we set it in the trunk, I glanced back at the house. The man was standing in the doorway, watching us. His figure was barely visible in the dim light, but I could feel his eyes on us as we got into the car and sped away. We didn't say much on the drive back. Jason was unusually quiet, staring out the window as the trees blurred by. The eerie stillness of the night seemed to follow us, clinging to the air like an unwelcome presence. When we finally arrived back at my house, I let out a long breath, relieved to be away from that place. Emily's car was parked in the driveway, and the lights were on inside. For the first time since we'd left the house, I felt a sense of normalcy return. "You're not seriously bringing that thing inside, are you?" Jason asked, eyeing the trunk with clear unease. "I'll just keep it in the garage for now," I replied, trying to sound nonchalant. "It's just a bunch of decorations, right?" Jason didn't respond. He just gave me a look that said he wanted nothing more to do with the trunk and got into his own car to head home. As I pushed the trunk into the garage, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The house, the man, the way he had watched us leave. It all felt too strange, too surreal. But I brushed it off, telling myself that I was just overthinking things. The next few days passed uneventfully, and I started to forget about the uneasy feeling that had settled in my gut that night. I busied myself with work and the usual routines, and Emily and I enjoyed our time together in the cozy little town. But then, things started to happen. Small, inexplicable things. It began with the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was just the creaking of the old house, but the sounds became more distinct. Slow, deliberate footsteps, as though someone was walking through the halls at night. I would hear them when I was alone, always just out of sight, always stopping when I tried to investigate. Then came the shadows. They would appear in the corners of my vision, fleeting and insubstantial, but there. I would turn, expecting to see someone, but there was never anyone there. The final straw came one night when I woke up to find the trunk at the foot of my bed. I hadn't moved it from the garage. I hadn't even opened it since we brought it home. And yet, there it was. That's when I knew. Something had followed us back from that house. Something was watching, waiting. It wasn't long before Emily started noticing things too. She would wake up in the middle of the night, her face pale, and tell me she'd heard whispering coming from the trunk. Neither of us wanted to admit it, but we were both terrified. One night, after another restless evening of hearing whispers and footsteps, Emily and I decided to get rid of the trunk. We drove it out to the forest, far from the house, and left it there, hoping that whatever haunted it would stay behind. But as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't truly escaped. Something still lingered in the air, watching, waiting. And as the autumn wind howled through the trees, I couldn't help but wonder if we had opened a door that could never be closed. From that day on, the house never felt the same. The shadows still crept in the corners of my vision, and the whispers still found their way into my dreams. And every October, as the leaves began to fall and the wind turned cold, I would hear those footsteps again. Slow, deliberate, always just behind me. And no matter how much I wanted to look back, I never did. It was the fall of 2022 when this all happened. I remember the year vividly, as it was the first time I had moved away from my small-town roots. I had taken a job offer in Ellensburg, Washington, a quiet town known for its windswept plains and the Cascade Mountains on the horizon. I was 24 and ready for a change of pace. My new job offered a remote option, so I rented a small cabin in the nearby woods, about 20 miles outside of town. I figured it would be a great opportunity to reconnect with nature, which I hadn't done in years. My cabin sat on the edge of the central Washington forest, a vast, sprawling woodland with miles of hiking trails. It was October, and the forests were glowing with fiery reds, oranges, and yellows. I had only been living there for a month, but I already found the trails relaxing and a perfect escape from the constant pressure of work. Most days, I had the trails all to myself, which added to the serene atmosphere. One Thursday afternoon, I decided to explore a part of the forest I hadn't visited yet, the Bear Ridge Trail. It was a less frequented path, deeper into the forest and more isolated, which made it the perfect place for some peace and quiet. The forecast warned of light rain, but I packed my rain jacket and figured it wouldn't be anything I couldn't handle. I parked at the trailhead, grabbed my backpack, and set out into the woods. The crisp autumn air felt refreshing, and the forest floor was blanketed with fallen leaves that crunched softly underfoot. I couldn't hear anything but the occasional bird call and the wind rustling the branches. The first couple of miles were uneventful but beautiful. After some time, I reached a small clearing where an old, weathered bench sat. As I sat down to take a break, I noticed something odd. A figure standing about 50 yards away, just beyond the tree line. It was a woman, and she seemed to be staring directly at me. Her presence startled me because I hadn't seen anyone else all day, but I waved, trying to be friendly. She didn't wave back. Instead, she turned and walked slowly into the woods, disappearing behind the trees. I felt a small chill run down my spine, but I brushed it off. Maybe she was just another hiker, someone who didn't feel like interacting. Still, I couldn't shake the weirdness of the encounter. Something about her was unsettling, the way she had been standing completely still, watching me. Her face, though distant, seemed blank, emotionless. I decided to continue my hike, trying not to think too much of it. But as I made my way deeper into the forest, I kept feeling like someone was watching me. The trees seemed denser here, the path less clear, and the silence more suffocating. The only sound was the occasional crack of a twig under my boots. After another mile, I reached a ridge that overlooked a small, winding river below. The view was stunning, but I barely had a chance to take it in before I saw the woman again. This time, she was standing on the opposite side of the river, watching me from the shadows of the trees. I froze. She was too far away to make out any details, but it was undoubtedly the same woman. Short, graying hair, pale complexion, and that unsettling stillness. I tried calling out to her this time, but she didn't respond. She just stood there, her face obscured by the shadows. Feeling a growing sense of unease, I decided it was time to turn back. As I retraced my steps, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see her following me. But each time, the trail was empty. By the time I made it back to the clearing, the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I quickened my pace, eager to get back to the safety of my car. Just before reaching the trailhead, I passed an older man walking his dog. I stopped him and asked if he had seen anyone else on the trail, specifically a woman. He looked confused and shook his head. "No, haven't seen anyone all day," he replied. "But be careful. These woods can play tricks on your mind when you're alone." His words left me with an uneasy feeling, but I thanked him and hurried back to my car. The drive home was quiet, and the isolation of my cabin felt less like a retreat and more like a trap that night. I locked all the doors and windows, trying to shake off the lingering tension. That night, I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of something scraping against the outside of the cabin. My heart raced as I sat up in bed, listening intently. The sound was faint but persistent, like someone was dragging their fingernails across the wooden walls. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and crept toward the window. With trembling hands, I pulled back the curtain just a crack, enough to peek outside. Standing at the edge of the tree line, illuminated by the faint glow of the moon, was the woman. She was facing the cabin, staring directly at my window. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. My mind raced with fear and disbelief. How could she have found me? I hadn't seen anyone follow me back. And why was she here, in the middle of the night? I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I kept the lights on, clutching the flashlight and a kitchen knife, waiting for the sun to rise. The next morning, she was gone, but her presence lingered in my mind like a shadow. Over the next few days, strange things began happening. I would hear footsteps outside at night, even though there were no tracks in the morning. Objects in my cabin would be moved or knocked over when I wasn't looking. Once, I found muddy footprints leading up to my front door, but they stopped just short of the threshold. The final straw came a week later when I found a note pinned to my front door with an old, rusted nail. The paper was yellowed and brittle, as if it had been weathered by years of exposure. Scrawled in shaky handwriting were the words, "She is watching." I left the cabin that day, packing my things and moving into a motel in town. I didn't care about losing the deposit or breaking the lease. I just wanted to get as far away from that forest as possible. I never found out who the woman was or what she wanted, but the thought of her still haunts me. Sometimes, late at night, I wake up expecting to see her standing at the foot of my bed, staring at me with those cold, empty eyes. And every fall, when the leaves start to turn and the winds begin to howl through the trees, I can't help but feel like she's still out there, somewhere in the pines, watching. It was a typical Friday evening in late October. The air was crisp, and the autumn wind whispered through the trees outside. I had just returned home from my part-time job at the local bookstore, where I'd been working since finishing college last spring. My place was a small, 2-story rental house on the outskirts of town. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was home, quiet and secluded, just the way I liked it. I dropped my keys on the kitchen counter, slipped off my shoes, and sank into the couch. I'd been looking forward to this moment all day, a night to myself with no distractions. I turned on Netflix, scrolling aimlessly through the endless options, settling on a horror movie, something to get my mind off the monotony of my work week. As I lounged on the couch, the glow of the TV flickered against the darkened walls. Outside, the wind picked up, tapping the branches of the old oak tree against the window. I paused the movie for a moment, leaning back into the cushions, letting the quiet of the house settle around me. The only sounds were the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards upstairs. I almost didn't hear it, the faint noise outside. At first, it sounded like leaves rustling in the yard. I dismissed it as nothing, maybe a raccoon or a stray cat. I hit play again, sinking deeper into my movie. But a few minutes later, the sound returned, this time louder, like something scraping against the side of the house. I paused the movie again and strained my ears. The wind had died down, and now the scraping noise was clearer, deliberate, like fingernails on wood. I got up from the couch, the cushions sighing as I moved. For a moment, I stood still, listening intently. The noise had stopped. I walked to the window and peered outside into the darkness, my breath fogging up the glass. Nothing. Just the familiar sight of my small front yard, the streetlight casting a soft, yellow glow over the sidewalk. But then, as I was about to turn away, I caught a glimpse of something. A shadow, large and distorted, moving just beyond the light's reach. It disappeared the moment I tried to focus on it, swallowed by the night. I stood there for a moment, staring into the dark, my heart thudding in my chest. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light, my mind playing games after watching a horror movie. I shook it off and returned to the couch, determined not to let it bother me. A few minutes passed, and I decided to grab some more snacks before settling in for the rest of the night. I headed down to the kitchen, flipping on the lights as I went. But when I reached the kitchen, I froze. The window above the sink was wide open. I distinctly remembered closing it earlier. Had I forgotten? Maybe. But with the strange noises outside and that shadow, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The cold breeze from outside crept into the room, and I hurried to shut the window, locking it tightly. My hands were trembling. I glanced around the kitchen, as if expecting someone to jump out from the shadows, but I was alone. A nervous laugh escaped me. I was being ridiculous. There was no one out there. I was letting the spooky atmosphere get the best of me. Still, I felt an uncomfortable knot forming in my stomach. I pulled out my phone, intending to call the police, just in case, but when I hit the power button, the screen stayed dark. My phone was dead. Great. Now more unsettled, I rummaged through the drawers until I found the charger. My hands fumbled as I plugged it in, my mind racing. As soon as the phone had enough charge, I dialed 911. The operator answered immediately. I tried to explain the situation, my voice shaky, but as I spoke, I wandered back upstairs, unable to sit still. I reached the second-floor window that overlooked the backyard, glancing outside as I continued to talk. And then I saw him. Standing by the edge of the woods, half hidden in the shadow of an old oak tree, was a figure. Tall and broad, dressed in a long, dark coat, the figure stood motionless, staring directly at me. I froze mid-sentence, the words catching in my throat. The operator's voice became a distant hum in my ear as my entire focus zeroed in on the figure outside. He didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there, watching. I finally snapped out of my trance, hurriedly finishing my conversation with the operator, telling them my address. They assured me police were on the way, but their words felt like they were coming from miles away. I hung up, my hand shaking as I set the phone down on the nightstand. My heart was hammering in my chest, my mind racing through a dozen horrible possibilities. Who was that? Why was he just standing there? I forced myself to move, tiptoeing back downstairs, as if being quieter would somehow keep me safe. I grabbed a kitchen knife and huddled by the staircase, waiting for the police to arrive. Every minute felt like an hour. The house, once my cozy refuge, now felt like a cold, unfamiliar prison. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows, made me flinch. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard the distant wail of sirens. I peeked out the window again, but the figure was gone. When the police arrived, I hesitated to open the door, my grip still tight around the knife. After checking the area thoroughly, they found no sign of anyone. No footprints, no evidence that someone had been in the yard. They assured me that the area was safe, but their words felt hollow. I told them about the noises, about the shadow, about the figure I'd seen standing beneath the tree. They nodded, scribbling notes in their little notepads, but I could tell they didn't believe me. They chalked it up to paranoia, maybe a prank from a neighborhood kid, or even just a trick of the mind. But I knew what I had seen. I knew that figure was real. They left after what felt like a very brief and unsatisfactory search, telling me to call again if anything unusual happened. I closed the door behind them, locked it, and leaned against it, trying to calm my racing heart. The house was quiet now. The wind had died down, and the tapping branches against the windows were gone. I glanced out one last time just to be sure. The yard was empty. The street was silent. But that feeling of being watched lingered. The image of the figure, standing in the shadow of the tree, burned in my mind. His stillness, the way he seemed to be waiting for something. I went to bed that night with the knife under my pillow, unable to shake the sense of unease. The police didn't find any footprints or signs of forced entry, but I couldn't stop feeling like he was still out there, watching. Every little sound, every creak, every rustle, made me sit up in bed, straining to hear something in the silence of the house. And when I finally drifted off to sleep, it was restless, filled with dreams of shadows slipping through the trees, just out of sight. The next day, things seemed normal again, but that strange feeling never really went away. Even as I went about my usual routine, I caught myself glancing out the windows, half expecting to see him standing there. The police never found anything, but I knew what I saw. And every so often, when the night is quiet and the wind dies down, I still get that feeling that someone somewhere is watching me from the shadows.